Hello students, this is Gaikwad sir, and once again I welcome you all to this video lecture of Innovative Public School. So my dear students, today we are going to begin the new topic of geography, that is natural vegetation and wildlife. So dear students, in this chapter mainly we are going to discuss about the natural vegetation of Brazil and the natural vegetation of our India. Also, we are going to discuss about the wildlife of Brazil and the wildlife of our India. So let's have the introduction what we are going to discuss in this lesson. So here we have the introduction. What is natural vegetation? Actually, what is natural vegetation? So natural vegetation actually refers to the natural community of maybe the plants. So this natural community remains undisturbed by the human activities. That is called the natural vegetation. So the natural vegetation which we find, that is totally undisturbed by the human activities. Okay, and that is what it is called the natural vegetation. So as I told you that we are going to discuss about the natural vegetation of Brazil in today's lecture, and also we will discuss about the natural vegetation of our India. And in the lesson, we will discuss about the Brazil wildlife and the wildlife of our India. So let's begin today's topic. So on your screen, my dear students, you can see here the physiography, the figure of physiography, natural vegetation and wildlife. This figure explains you the rainfall, flora and fauna of Brazil. For example, here you have the Guiana Highland. This region is Guiana Highland. This region is Amazon Basin. This region we have Paraguay-Parana Basin. Here we have Brazilian Highlands. And here, this part, we have the coastal areas. Now look at this Guiana Highlands region. Here you can see the temperature, if we see, then that is 21 degrees Celsius, and here we find 1600 millimeter rainfall. That is called the tropical forest. Okay. Then if we come over the Amazon basin, here we will find equatorial forest, and there we have 28 degrees Celsius temperature and 2000 millimeter rainfall. It means in Amazon basin we find more rainfall than Guiana Highlands. Then if we go to the Paraguay-Parana Basin region, there we will find 21 degrees Celsius temperature and 1500 millimeter rainfall. If we move further to the Brazilian Highlands, there we will find 23 degrees Celsius temperature and 600 millimeter rainfall. And to the coastal region if we go, then we will find 27 degrees Celsius temperature and 1200 millimeter rainfall. So my dear students, by this graph you will come to know that the more rainfall we find in the equatorial region, that is equatorial forest. Now where is the equatorial forest? So the equatorial forest is in Amazon basin. So in Amazon basin, basically we will find the most rain or the highest rainfall we will see in the Amazon basin. Comparing to the other regions, Amazon basin region receives the most rainfall or the more rainfall. That is what here we will find the evergreen forest in the Amazon basin. Okay. So by this graph, you must have come to know that according to this rainfall, it affects also the life of the animals and the life of the plants. So it has the effect on the life of the plants as well as the life of the animals. So the types of forest we find in the Brazil, different types of forest we find in the Brazil, that I will explain you later on. So see here in Guiana Highland, various types of apes, reptiles, then arboreal and aquatic animals we find. Here in Paraguay-Parana Basin we find the grassland animals. And in the Brazilian highlands we find reptiles and grassland animals. So this is the different types of things which we see to the different types of regions. Okay, now let's move further. So my dear students, let us begin the Brazil vegetation. What type of vegetation we find in Brazil? Let's discuss about them. So here, my dear students, you can see equatorial region. This is the equatorial region. In the graph also I explained. So actually in the equatorial region, okay, it rains throughout the year. And that is what this equatorial region, we find the evergreen and dense forest we find in the equatorial region. So that is what, as we move from the equatorial region, then the rainy days and also the rainfall reduces. It means it decreases. Okay, as I told you that in the tropical forest or Guyana highlands or the Brazilian highlands, okay, it rains very less there as we move from the equatorial region. It means from the Amazon basin, as we move, okay, to the Guyana highlands or to the Paraguay Parana basin or to the Brazilian highlands or the coastal region. So we find that the rainy days or the rainfall reduces or it decreases from the equatorial as we move. Okay, and that is what the evergreen forests are found, okay, where it rains highly. In those regions only we find the evergreen forests. Okay, then let's move further. So my dear students, here we should understand that Brazil has the largest number of vegetations. Okay, species basically. We find the largest number of vegetation species in Brazil. Okay, for example, evergreen forest we have. Then we have semi-evergreen forest. And then we have the arid vegetation. So these three types of vegetation basically we find, or the species of forest we find in Brazil. Then we find the different types of trees also in Brazil. For example, pau-brasil is a kind of tree which we find in this type of region. Then next tree which we have, that is the rubber tree. Then here we have mahogany tree, okay, rosewood tree. So these types of trees we find in these regions. Also, my dear students, Amazon evergreen forest is called the lungs of the planet. Now, why it is called the lungs of the planets? So the Amazon is called the lungs because it is our world's biggest supply of oxygen. So see, more than 20% of the oxygen is produced from this one forest, and that is what it is called the lungs of the world. Here you can see the different types of forest which we find in Brazil. For example, we find the equatorial forest, tropical grassland, then swampy lands, hot deciduous forest, thorny shrubs, and temperate grasslands. So these types of forests we find in Brazil. And the types of animals which we find in Brazil, that we are going to discuss in the next video lecture. So my dear students, in this way we finished about the Brazil vegetation. Now let us discuss about the Indian vegetation. What type of vegetation India has? Let's discuss. So my dear students, here you have the map of India which describes the major forest of our India. So evergreen forest, deciduous forest, then thorny shrubs, Himalayan forest, and coastal forest. These types of the forest we find in our India, and we are going to discuss in today's lecture. So evergreen forest. So where do we find the evergreen forest? So you can see here the dark green part which you can see here in the western part of our India and northeast part in this region. Okay. So this evergreen forest basically we find where it rains more than 2000 millimeter. Okay. So where we find the rainfall more than 2000 millimeter, there only we find the evergreen forest. Then different types of trees we find there. For example, rubber tree. Okay. So the trees are found evergreen region. For example, these trees basically have the hard wood, that we should come to know. Okay, so where we find the evergreen forest. So evergreen forest we find in the region where it rains more than 2000 millimeter. There we find the rubber tree. Okay, so these trees basically the wood is very hard and also heavy. Also we find the mahogany tree also in these evergreen forests of our India. Also we find the rosewood tree. So these types of trees we find in these regions. But also we should understand that the creepers are also found in these regions or in these types of forest. Not only the creepers, but also the highest biodiversity also is found in the evergreen forest. So this is also very important thing. Then you can see here now the next, that is the deciduous forest. Now where do we find the deciduous forest? So actually deciduous forest we find in this region. The light green part which you can see, that is called the deciduous forest. So where do we find? So we find it in where rainfall is between 1000 to 2000 millimeter. Okay, in these regions we find the deciduous forest. Okay, then we have here the teak tree. Okay, now what is that teak tree? So this teak tree we find in this type of forest. Bamboo tree we find in this type of forest. Then banyan tree. Okay, peepal tree. So these types of trees basically we find in the deciduous type of forest. Then the thorny shrubs forest. Actually in thorny shrubs forest we find in this region, the dark grey color part which you can see, there we find the thorny shrubs types of forest. So actually these types of vegetation is found in this region. Okay, some of the part of Gujarat and Rajasthan also, and here some of the part of Maharashtra, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu also. So there, okay, what is the rainfall? So rainfall is less than 500 millimeter in this region. So that is what we find there, thorny and shrub type of forest. Actually they need the very less water to grow, and that is what we find that type of. Now let us see what type of trees we find in this region. So basically catechu tree we find in this region because they receive very less water to grow. Then acacia tree, then khejri tree, and then the types of cactus also we find in this region. For example, aloe vera and agave. So these types of cactus also we find cactus type of plants in these regions. Then my dear students, mangroves and sundarbans. Now where do we find the mangroves and sundarbans? So basically in swampy areas where we find the estuaries and the lagoons, okay, near to the coastal areas. Okay, actually what happens there, we have the saline soil. Saline soil is created, and mostly we find the moist climate in this region, and that is what we find the mangroves are grown in this region, or the sundarbans are created in these regions. So this type of vegetation is also found in our country. Okay, then let us discuss about the Himalayan forest. What type of forest we find in the Himalayas? So my dear students, here we should come to know that we find the three types of forest in the Himalayas. For example, higher altitude, then medium altitude, and mixed forest. So these forests are dependent according to the altitude. For example, to the higher altitude we find the flowering trees. Okay, you can see here in the images where we find the higher altitude. In the medium altitude we find the pine tree, then deodar tree, fir tree. So these types of trees we find in the medium altitude forest. Okay, and then at the foothills of the Himalayas basically we find the mixed forest, that is called the mixed forest. Okay, and the proportion of sal tree is more in the mixed forest. So So these are the three types of forest which we find in the Himalayas. So my dear students, I hope you understood the vegetation of Brazil and the vegetation of India. In the next video lecture, we will discuss about the wildlife of Brazil and the wildlife of our India. Thank you very much.